This is lecture 28B in the series, The ABCs of Communism. My name's Jason Smith. This is based on the chapter 44, which is going to be in next year's ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2016 edition. But as I said last time, since I've already started writing that, we can go ahead and continue with these lectures, which to a certain degree, of course, repeat what's in that chapter, but it also gives me an opportunity to approach some of the same subject matter in a different way. The first of the presidents that we're going to be dealing with is Jose Lopez Portillo, and not just with the president, but with the 6-year term that he served from 1976 to 1982. It is most convenient to divide Mexican history into these presidential terms. And just one more comment, all of these Mexican presidents are referred in the Mexican press in terms of their initials. So this fellow was known as JLP, JLP in Spanish. But at any rate, these early years of the Lopez Portillo administration, I was in prison in Mexico City, in Lima, Peru, thanks to the U.S. CIA DEA plot that got me there and that I was stupid enough to walk into. And after I escaped from that joint in 1980, came back to the States because I didn't come back on the treaty that my wife and Frank Church had managed to get passed in Congress, which allowed for people who had been convicted down there to do their terms in the States, but would also, of course, put you into the U.S. probation system. Since I made it back on my own, I didn't have to put up with all that nonsense. But it didn't mean that I hadn't had a fairly difficult first year of adjusting to the, well, I guess what you'd call post-traumatic stress of that 3-year prison experience in Peru, in Latin America's worst prison, as it was then known. But to make a long story short, I had the opportunity to go out to Louisiana and join with a company called NL Industries. And so by the time we pick up this Lopez Portillo story, I'm going to be working for NL Industries in Louisiana, and then they decided to send me to Mexico. The point to all of this is that things happened in Louisiana and Mexico which prepared me in a way that I had not anticipated even a year earlier to re-enter the Latin American scene. Not the least of which is that when I was in Houma, Louisiana, doing my initial training and schooling out there in the fall of 1981 and in the beginning of 1982, a Mexican engineer named Jose Medrano had been sent up to us for training in pipe recovery, which means how to back off stuck drill pipe when a driller gets stuck in a well. And that was going to turn out to be kind of important here pretty quickly. What had happened is that my wife and I had settled into Houma, Louisiana, and we were doing pretty well there, and I had lost interest in the possibility of going back to Mexico, which I had talked to our manager about, the manager for international relations in Houston when I'd been in school over there, in the NL school for petroleum engineers. And we kind of just wanted to stay in Louisiana. We had an interesting situation where our shop out on Bayou Blue Road was divided in half. On the right-hand side, as you would, if you were looking south and walking in from that road, were the older men who were the district manager and assistant manager in their 60s. And these guys were stone alcoholics, and I had plenty of experience drinking, so I could go over there. I was halfway between their age and the kids that were on the left side of the street, who were the brighter, best petroleum engineering graduates that Nicholas State University ever produced, which was the state university pretty close to us near Thibodaux, Louisiana. And these kids were all into cocaine and marijuana, so I could do that too. So I got along with both sides of that fence pretty well. Anyway, Medrano came in there for his education on this side of the border. He spoke English perfectly, and he had a 5-year engineering degree from the Mexican University in Mexico City, UNAM, and I, of course, already knew about the history of the Mexican oil field from my trip down there 20 years earlier that we discussed in the first lectures on Mexico in this series. And I won't go back over that again, but at any rate, Medrano got a cold reception from these boys who considered themselves to be the New South, although I could never see much difference between the New South and the Old South, although I kept my opinion to myself. So I decided to take Medrano under my wing because he was a nice guy, and I was sympathetic to his situation and the history of the Mexican oil field. And so because of the young fellows over there respected me, and because of my PhD and something they respected, and of course from my more action-oriented background to do drugs with them. And of course I had the best-looking woman in Houma, Louisiana anyway, in the form of my wife, who the guys couldn't keep their eyes in their head whenever she came out to visit us. So I was pretty popular over there. When I took Medrano under my wing, he quickly was accepted by the rest of them. This becomes important later on. Okay, let's go back to Mexico proper. Lopez Portillo got the finger from Luis Echeverria. That is, he was appointed to succeed Luis Echeverria, and he won that election, obviously, in 1976 fairly easily. But what was different about this particular election was that the Communist Party of Mexico re-entered the presidential race against him. Now, of course, they couldn't win because nobody could ever beat a pre-candidate, but let alone a communist, of course. But the communist candidate was Valentin Campa. Now, he's a man that I had gotten to know about from Carlos Prieto 20 years earlier when I had been in Mexico, because Valentin Campa and Carlos Prieto had been on the run when Lopez Mateos decided to crack down on them and put them in jail. Well, he got Campa in jail. Carlos Prieto escaped to New York City, where he became an information officer for the United Nations. And I met him as soon as he got back to Mexico City in September 1962, just before the October missile crisis, which I've talked to you about in previous lectures. So Valentin Campa re-entered this picture in 1976 as the presidential candidate of the Communist Party of Mexico. Now, Campa himself had a really fascinating background. He was one of the early recruits of the Jose Allen Communist Party. You remember that Jose Allen was the man that Borodin appointed that became head of the Mexican Communist Party when Borodin visited there in 1919. Borodin left immediately, went to Cuba, did the same thing over there, set up a CP there, and then went back to Europe. But so Valentin Campa came into the party in 1927 at the age of 25 years old. Now, he was seen as, he was extremely active, and he became the youngest member of the Mexican Communist Party Central Committee. He worked on the railroad unions primarily, as opposed to the other union work that Jose Allen's guys were doing with the oil field workers union. Well, the important point about that really was that by the time that 1940 came around and the next World War was on the horizon, it was only, well, at any rate, David Siqueiros tried to recruit him to be part of the May 1940 assassination attempt on Trotsky. Now, Campa refused to do that, not because he didn't think Trotsky should be killed, but because he thought Siqueiros would fuck it up, which he did, as we discussed before. So temporarily he got kicked out of the Communist Party, but the whole matter became moot when Beria's next man succeeded a few months later in killing Trotsky. And as you know, that fella did 20 years in the Mexican prison. When he got out in 1960, he went to Havana, and then he went to Moscow. In Moscow, Khrushchev gave him the Order of Lenin and Hero of the Soviet Union medal, and Stalin had awarded him in absentia, and that was the end of that story. But at any rate, so now Valentin Campa quickly came back into the Communist Party after the Trotsky matter was resolved, and now he's their candidate for president in 1976, and he ran a hell of a campaign across the country. Now, the pre-government would not allow him or his party to be officially registered, but So he ran a write-in campaign. In the end, he got over 1 million votes. So it was kind of like the election of Eugene Debs. You may recall he ran against Woodrow Wilson from his prison cell. He got over 1 million votes. So the Valentin Coppa thing, while he couldn't possibly win because nobody could win, he at least had made a valiant effort and most importantly had reorganized and revitalized the Communist Party on a national level. So that's what had happened in 1976. At any rate, when Lopez Portillo got elected in 1976, that he assumed the presidency. Now, as I say, these first few years of his administration, I was not there. So I learned about them after I got back, and especially when I got there to Mexico. So what had happened is in the first 4 years actually, of the Lopez Portillo administration, everything had gone his way. Well, why was that? Well, it's because during the Luis Echeverria years, a huge amount of oil had been discovered in what Pemex calls Zone 5, which is the Bay of Campeche area of the Gulf of Mexico, and on land and offshore. And now, but that had been kept under wraps as a state secret during the course of the election. Now that Lopez Portillo was president, he announced the discovery of these vast Tabasco, Chiapas, offshore Veracruz oil fields, and all of a sudden Mexico was swimming in cash. So he had the money that he wanted in order to put the pre-program, which, as you may know, is we'll take plenty of money for our own corrupt officials, but there'll be plenty left over for the common workers, and we'll see that they get it. In other words, a Peronista, a Perón kind of approach. And that's exactly what what Jose Lopez Portillo did in the first 4 years of his administration. Now, however, in 1982, beginning in 1981, actually, there was a collapse in the world oil prices. And what this had done was to reverse Lopez Portillo's decision to give the finger, his successor. As you know, the Mexican president always chooses his own successor. He was going to appoint his oil minister, a guy named Jose Diaz Serrano, or Jorge Diaz Serrano, to the presidency. And he had tentatively received the finger from Lopez Portillo, but he made the critical mistake of overstepping his bounds and reducing the price of Mexican oil, of crude, unilaterally without talking to his boss about it. Now, the significance of this is that each Mexican president takes a cut of so many dollars per barrel off of every barrel of oil that goes out of Mexico. So by cutting the overall price of oil per barrel, he was cutting Lopez Portillo's last big grab at the Mexican oil field money. And for that, he got fired. And of course, the finger was removed, and Lopez Portillo instead appointed one of his ministers, a young man named Miguel de la Madrid Hurtado, which we'll talk about next, as the next Mexican president. And of course, he got elected. Now, I got down there just at the end of the Lopez Portillo administration and just at the beginning of the Miguel de la Madrid administration. And what had happened there is that when I had been in petroleum engineering school in Houston, the international manager for NL McCullough, which NL was a holding company for several hundred oil field service companies that they had bought in the previous few years, and that had made them one of the big top 3 oil field service conglomerates in the world. The other two were Schlumberger and Halliburton. We've talked about Schlumberger quite a bit because it was Stalin that made the Schlumberger family into the wealthiest family in France and the biggest oil field service company in the world. And I won't go back over that, but at any rate, the point is, now I was working for one of these 3 conglomerates, and they had talked to me about going back to Mexico. And when I was in school over there, I mean back to Latin America, this time in Mexico, when I was in school, it seemed like maybe that was a good idea. Billy Don Jones had offered me the job as assistant manager for Mexico oil field district in Villahermosa in April, but I turned him down because my wife and I were doing well there. And we'd both had been through quite a bit in the years that I was in Peru, and we were enjoying living kind of a normal life in Louisiana. But what had happened was in August, I got another call from our manager named Darrell Gwynn up in New Orleans, and he said, Billy Don Jones is going to call you in a few minutes and he's going to offer you this job again because the last guy quit down there in Villahermosa, the one they sent down there instead of you. And he's going to offer you the job again, and I want you to know that you told Billy Don last time that you'd given me your word that you'd stay here for at least a year, and I'm releasing you from that promise. And furthermore, if you don't take that job that he's offering you this time, you'll probably be unemployed in a short period of time. So I really didn't have any choice. When Jones called, I said, sure, I'll take it. And he said, well, as soon as you can get over here, do it, because I want to introduce you to the manager who's in Houston right now, and you guys can go back to Mexico together. So I had gone over to Houston. Rachel had agreed. She had a job working for the state of Louisiana in a new project they had going there on marine resource conservation. At any rate, I had gone over there and I had met King Freeland Jr. and his wife, and we were on the plane heading down there. But before we left, Billy Don had taken me aside and said, listen, this is just between you and me. Almost undoubtedly we're going to shut down that district here in a few weeks or months, because we have not been paid in Mexico for a year because of this crisis. And our board in New York doesn't want to put up with that anymore. So when it happens, you're the one that's going to shut it down. But it's a secret for now. And I said, all right. Well, anyway, so I went down there knowing that this might be a short job and then my major contribution would be to shut it down. All right, so that was at the end of the Lopez Portillo administration. Now, to skip up to what was going to happen next, let me just say that Miguel de la Madrid won the election in '82, and as soon as he took office, a new crisis emerged. Now, we still hadn't been paid, but I'd been thinking about ways in which this might happen, because Lopez Portillo had nationalized in his last month as president, nationalized all of Mexico's banks, which meant that all these private banks were now public banks. And to me, that opened up an obvious source of a way of getting paid, but I just kept my thinking to myself, wait and see what was going to happen. Well, what happened was this. Billy Don Jones called me not long after Miguel de la Madrid came into office and asked me if I would, or told me that I was going, in 48 hours, he was going to shut this place down. And I decided, I knew if I was going to do anything to reverse that, I had to do it right now. There was only one way to reverse it, and that was to get these Mexican tickets that we'd been accumulating at the rate of about $300,000 a month for over a year, to get those things paid. And I had an idea about how to do that, which went back to this fellow Luis Contreras, which we talked about before. I'll just go over that again for you, because all of this is important background. Luis Contreras was the boss of foreign oil field workers for Zone 5, which of course included our company and El McCullough. And he had been in my office the very first day I got there. And he had told me that he had discovered Montezuma's lost treasure, which I was pretty well sure that was bullshit, because I didn't even think there was such a thing. But he had some photographs with him, and he showed them to me, and he said, you see, these are all things that I've excavated, and what he wanted to do was to get me to authenticate them. Well, I wasn't about to get into that for a whole bunch of reasons, but I couldn't tell him that. So I said, I'll tell you what we better do. I'll send these to Michael Coe up at Yale. He will tell me what he thinks about it, and my opinion doesn't really matter, because I'm an Arctic specialist in archaeology. This guy Contreras already had a copy of my book. I guess he must have got it from King Freeland. At any rate, Foundations of Archaeology, that book I'm talking about. At any rate, he said, oh, okay, well, so I sent him up there, but I was just buying time. And then I got a letter back within a couple of weeks from Michael Coe, and he said, this is obviously fake. You could even see the saw marks on some of this stuff, which I hadn't seen, but at any rate, I told my manager, and he said, well, we got don't tell Luis this, whatever you do. And I said, yeah, I understand. Right now we have a pretty good relationship, which we need, but if I tell him his stuff is all shit, then of course that we won't have a good relationship. So we'll buy some time here and figure out what to do. So, well, in the meantime, I had gotten into that fight with that oil field worker, and Luis Contreras had come to my assistance in that matter, which I won't go back over again. And this time I called him and asked him to meet me at the airport. I got out of my Guayabera, went upstairs, changed into a suit, told Connie to get me the file of all of these past tickets that hadn't been paid. Took a taxi out to the airport. I met Luis Contreras there. I explained to him the situation on the way up on the airplane. This is less than an hour flight from Villahermosa to Mexico City. Once we got there, we got a taxi. We went straight to the Banamex main office in Mexico City, which was where we had an account anyway, and which was now a government bank. When we got there, we were quickly shown into a waiting room, and the manager for the entire bank came to see us, especially when he heard that Luis Contreras was with me, because Contreras is one of the big bosses of the Oilfield Workers Union of the Republic of Mexico, and not the kind of guy that you want to fool around with. These STPRM bosses will kill you just as quick as they'll look at you if you happen to get on the wrong side of them. So he was there, and I told him, listen, the reason I'm here is because now that you're a government bank, I think you could easily see your way through to giving us a loan that would be sufficient to cover all of these tickets. And I handed him the file, and he looked at it and listened to what I had to say, and I said, and then when the government gets ready to pay these tickets, because they've already agreed to pay them, they just don't have the money right now, then you can collect from them on that, and of course add whatever service fee is appropriate, which of course we would agree to. And now sitting over there was Luis Contreras, and he had a silver skull ring where the jaw of the skull moved up and down, and it had red rubies for eyes. And he was playing with that thing, and I'd seen him do this with field workers out at the shop, and they had told me that when he starts playing with that ring, it's because he's telling you the consequences of arguing with him will be severe. I said, okay. So I couldn't help but notice that Luis was fooling around with his ring over there while I was talking. So I said, now, if you agree to all this, fine, and if you don't agree, well, then you need to work that out with him now. That's all it took. The manager said, oh, this will be fine. I'll put whatever it was, $1 million in your account right now, and I assume more of these will be coming, and we'll do the same thing as it goes on, and eventually we'll collect on these tickets from the government. You don't need to worry about it. So that solved that problem. We got on the plane, and we were back down in Villahermosa before it was time to go to dinner. And I had another guy visiting me. Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gotcha had gotten into the airport, and Rachel, he was a Colombian drug trafficker, and who I had known from Colombia. He had called me, and Rachel was going to take him around town that day. So, all right, so much for the background on De La Madrid. On Lopez Portillo. So, what was this man like himself? Well, Lopez Portillo is kind of an interesting character, I think, because he's the last of the authentic nationalist presidents, which doesn't mean that he wasn't a crook, because he was. But then all of the Mexican presidents since Lázaro Cárdenas have been crooks. And that kind of just goes with the territory. He was born in Mexico City. His father was a rather famous person who was an engineer, historian, a researcher, and a Mexican academic. And his mother was also came from a reasonably well-known family. So Lopez Portillo was a member of Mexico's pre-revolutionary elite as the grandson of Jose Lopez Portillo y Rojas, a lawyer, politician, and man of letters. And he was the great-great-great-grandson of Jose Maria Narvaez, who was the Spanish explorer who was the first to enter the Strait of Georgia in British Columbia, and supposedly the first Spaniard to view the site that's now occupied by the city of Vancouver. So you can see that he had a legitimate long pedigree, to the degree that pre-Easta presidents would admit that there was a Mexican aristocracy. He was certainly part of it. Well, he got a law degree from UNAM, that is from the National Autonomous University in Mexico City, and then he joined the Revolutionary Party in 1959, started his career with them, and he had held several positions in the administration of the two preceding presidents, including being finance minister from 1973 to 1975 for Luis Echeverria, who was his close friend from childhood. Now, anybody that is a close friend of Luis Echeverria's has got to be a stone criminal, and to be finance minister on top of it. So you can see that he had all of the qualifications to get the finger from Luis Echeverria, which he had done. And then, of course, I just told you that he got the surprise of running against Valentin Campa. Well, even though they wouldn't give Valentin Campa an official status, they wouldn't let him on television or any of that stuff, he still made a huge appearance, brought out hundreds of thousands of people in 97 campaign stops he made across Mexico during the course of the campaign. So it did two things. In reality, it made the Lopez Portillo election more interesting for people because he had a real opponent for once, and also it did something for his legitimacy in the sense that there was somebody running against him who thought enough of his politics to bother putting up an opposition, and of course it did the Communist Party a great deal of good and brought them back into the political picture in Mexico again, and they had been pretty well suppressed since the Tlatelolco massacre of Luis Echeverria. Well, and by the way, I mentioned to you last time how Echeverria had ordered the murder of these students, including Denis Prieto in Nepantla, Mexico, and I noticed since then that since I gave that lecture, that the Zapatista National Liberation Army has their own website, and on it they have pictures of her death photo after she was shot to death, laying on the ground, and pictures of her prior to that in her life. Well, anyway, where am I here? So, what happened right after this period of time was that when Miguel de la Madrid took the reins of office, he suddenly was confronted with a resurgent Jorge Diaz Serrano. Now, what had happened is, when Lopez Portillo fired Diaz Serrano, he had tried to kick him upstairs and out of the picture, and he had given him the job as being Mexico's ambassador to the Soviet Union, which was a very prestigious appointment because the Soviet Union had been Mexico's #1 international ally ever since the days of Plutarco Calles and Lázaro Cárdenas. So that was supposed to satisfy him for the time being, but it didn't. And as soon as he could, as soon as the election was over for Miguel de la Madrid, the guy that had replaced him on the ticket, he went back to Mexico. He ran for the pre-candidate for the Senate from the state of Sonora. He won that election, and now he was back in Mexico City as a senator with immunity, he thought, from prosecution or anything else. Now, because Mexican senators and congressmen can't be pursued in the courts. That's part of the Constitution. But what happened was that once he got back there, and Miguel de la Madrid perceived him as a threat, and could see that what he was going to do was to try to become the pre-candidate to succeed Miguel de la Madrid, he decided to get rid of him. And what happened was he had the Mexican Senate strip Lopez Portillo of his, strip this guy Diaz Serrano of his immunity, and then he had him charged and with several felonies, oil corruption felonies, of which I'm sure he was guilty, but because that just goes with the job. But at any rate, he ended up spending the next 6 years in prison. And now, this becomes even more important because Diaz Serrano probably was of threat to Miguel de la Madrid, not just because of himself, but because his business partner was George H.W. Bush. And this was an old relationship, and Miguel de la Madrid probably was contacted by George H.W. Bush to try and get his friend out of prison, and he said no, he's going to stay there for 6 years. So whether that contact ever happened or not, and Bush never admitted that it did, the Wall Street Journal always wanted it to happen, and every year they would publish an article about how poor old Diaz Serrano had been persecuted and thrown into jail for no good reason. Well, the truth of the matter is there was never a more corrupt person in Mexico than Diaz Serrano, both in his personal life and his public life, but of course you couldn't expect the truth from the Wall Street Journal, could you? So, at any rate, what happened now was that what we had thought was going to happen, what Luis Contreras and I thought was going to happen, was that Miguel de la Madrid was going to move against La Quina, the head of the Oilfield Workers Union. And in fact, it had gone to the point that one day, by this time, of course, as you can see, Luis Contreras and I, he's given up on the whole idea of me helping him with his artifacts, and he doesn't care. Whatever he's going to do with those, he's pursuing in a different direction. But we have graduated to an entirely new level of working together, and he had come to me as soon as Miguel de la Madrid got elected, thinking that because his boss, Don Andres Sanchez Solis, head of the Oilfield Workers Union for Zone 5, thought that this guy was going to go after his boss, this La Quina, the boss of all of Mexico's oilfield unions, not just the one in Zone 5. His real name is Joaquin Galicia Hernandez, but known throughout Mexico as La Quina. And Don Andres Sanchez Solis, Luis Contreras' boss, had decided to side with his boss, which had always been loyal to him. And so Luis was siding with him, and I decided to side with Luis. So, because of our now long-standing close relationship, but what had happened in reality was that Miguel de la Madrid had moved first against Diaz Serrano, and that had taken all his efforts. So the campaign against La Quina was set over until the next president came into office. And we'll get to that here momentarily in a few moments. So, now what I want to do here is so at any rate, I recall that when Luis Contreras came to see me right after the Miguel de la Madrid administration inauguration about Diaz Serrano making a play for the support of Don Andres Sanchez Solis, that Luis had decided to throw his support behind Don Andres Sanchez Solis, and there was going to be an armed shootout in Tamaulipas as part of a general oil field-wide onshore and offshore confrontation between the union and the government, and between Diaz Serrano and the president. Sanchez Solis had decided to throw his support behind the president, meaning against his boss, La Quina, and Luis was going to be loyal to the Sanchez Solis who had always treated him well, and he made that decision. He said now I had to make a decision. I decided immediately to throw in behind my benefactor, who had twice thrown in behind me, and whose boss, Sanchez Solis, would soon save my life in the exploding Learjet accident that killed engineer Centeno, and all aboard, I think I've mentioned in these lectures before. But at any rate, it's in the book. If you're interested, you can read it. I told Luis I was in for the strike, and with him, and I asked what he wanted me to do, and he said he wanted me to take a lead in getting all the foreign oil companies, service providers in Mexico, in Villahermosa, to give these monthly staple baskets to the wives of the oil field workers. Now, what that was about, and I agree, that what that was about was many of these oil field workers, especially if they're single, but sometimes the married men too, would get their paycheck at the end of the week, and then they'd just go out and blow it in bars on wine, women, and song, whatever. And when that happened, the married ones, at least, their wives got really upset, and they would come right over to the union office and bitch about it. So the Luis Contreras solution was to have a basket of food of all the monthly staples that a woman and her family could need available for her, in addition to the salary that her husband was going to receive. So I agreed to that, and it was really relatively inexpensive for us, and I could pay for it out of petty cash fund. So Billy Don Jones in Houston didn't even need to know about it. So I agreed to that, and he also wanted me to help him get the other foreign oil field service company to do the same thing. So I went with him to their offices, and they agreed to do the same thing pretty quickly once they learned that we had thrown in behind it. And so we had gotten that much done. But that is about as far as the fight that was heading toward La Quina went during that Miguel de la Madrid administration. In the next one, we'll talk about in a minute, in the next government of Carlos Salinas de Gortari, he would take on La Quina, and we'll get to that as soon as fairly shortly. But at any rate, it was a pretty tense period there when we didn't know what was going to happen. Luis Contreras had suggested I start carrying a gun. I told him I already did that. I thought that was about the only way a gringo in the oil field could operate in Mexico. At any rate, and he eventually brought me an automatic weapon of some kind. I don't recall what. That's when we were thinking that we were going to have to go with Don Andres Sanchez Solis up to actually challenge the. But instead, they got it on an oil platform and on an airplane. Went out to helicopters. Went out to the oil platforms. And that was the end of the matter. We didn't have to go any further than that. Well, now, going back to how this Diaz Serrano thing came down, it's important because it gives us a very close look at the Mexican oil field. In order to understand what Mexican working people in the Communist Party confronted in these years, you have to take a look at how Mexican fascism evolved from its inherent Peronismo, Juan Perón in other words, to a more or less permanent accommodation with the U.S. IMF neoliberal fascism. Now, one key to this understanding is the life and business history of Jorge Diaz Serrano, as I've just mentioned. Another key is the life and business history of George Herbert Walker Bush. Still one more key is to understand that the havoc wrought inside the Communist Party of Mexico by Nikita Khrushchev and his successors, modern revisionism. Well, let's begin with the former. Jorge Diaz Serrano was born in Nogales, Sonora State, on February 6, 1921. He became an engineer and politician, a member of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, as senator from Sonora State and chief executive officer of Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex, usually called the oil minister. He eventually died in Mexico City in 2011, but at any rate, this is how he started out in 1921. Now, as a native of Nogales, Sonora, where he completed elementary, middle, and high school, those of you who know Mexico or Southwest U.S. geography at all know that Nogales is the last point in Arizona on your way south into Mexico. So he completed his middle, elementary, high school education there, but then moved to Mexico City. He got a degree as a mechanical engineer in the Electrician School of Mechanical Electrical Engineering at the National Polytechnic Institute. And his friendship with leading persons who would come to occupy high political office in Mexico dates from this period. One of whom was President Jose Lopez Portillo, President Luis Echeverria, and Mexico City Police Chief Arturo Durazo Moreno. That won't mean much to you people right now, I don't suspect, but Arturo Durazo Moreno got to be famous as one of the most corrupt cops in the history of Mexico. But at any rate, after university graduation, he was hired by the American company Fairbanks Morse, and they sent him to Chicago for 2 years as an intern. When he returned to Mexico, he was the Fairbanks Morse representative for Mexico. Okay, let's take a look at the Bush and Walker family origins, because this is really important, kind of interesting, and complicated. Now, the rise of the Bushes, the indispensable role of the Walkers, and the path to power laid by Prescott Bush. That's what we're going to be looking at here. Now, in some ways, it's a story similar to the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys. Both stories are sweeping dramas of love, money, politics, and privilege. Both stories purposefully obscured by the Walker and Bush families and their flunky historians, as is the official story of the Kennedys, an obscuration of what really happened. The English-bred Bushes and the Scottish origin of Walkers both arrived in New England before the American Revolution. So in other words, the Bushes come from England, the Walkers came from Scotland. They came to New England before 1776. Now the Walker gang began with a slaver Walker who brought black slaves from Africa to the southern states of the USA. He was one of the subclass of British petty bourgeoisie with just enough money gathered in one underhanded way or another to buy a ship. Others of this ilk went into piracy and privateering out of Nassau, Bahamas. But this Walker saw the opportunity of picking up black slaves on the West African coast and transporting them to the USA. This original Walker had a son who saw the opportunity in shipping cotton on his father's ships to the textile factories of England, and therefore he invested heavily in temporarily cheap land unsuited for food crops in the southern states, and there he could and did sweat the slave labor that his father had brought over to the nth degree. He built a huge financial empire and prospered by growing cotton with slave labor in the decades prior to the Civil War in a Candyland kind of operation. And if you haven't seen the movie Django Unchained, you certainly want to see that to see what Candyland was like. Well, that's exactly what Walker set up. This Walker established a link to the North when he built a banking branch in the slave state of Missouri. Now, you know, during the Civil War, Missouri was one of those border states that Lincoln always had to take into consideration in terms of how he was going to deal with them. He didn't free the slaves in the border states as long as until he absolutely had to, and so that was because it's a concession to Missouri being a border state. Here, however, Walker could get direct ties to the northern financial cities, and the Walker family flourished in finance. When he saw that the South was going to lose the Civil War, he was in an excellent position to shift his ill-gotten gains into the northern banks, which he therefore did. Now, all this time, the Bushes made their fortune in steel plants and railroads of Ohio, collaborating as they did with E.H. Harriman and Andrew Carnegie. E.H. Harriman, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller controlled the railroads, the steel, and oil, three major sinews of the U.S. Industrial Revolution. E.H. Harriman, you may recall, was referred to by the young clerk of Woodcock on the train that Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid robbed. He would say, "Mr. E.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific Railroad has entrusted me to protect this." He wouldn't open the door, and finally Butch had to blow it open. If you haven't seen the movie or if you've forgotten it, you might want to take a look at it again. Well, anyway, that's who E.H. Harriman was, king of the U.S. railroads, and the railroad equivalent of Rockefeller in oil and Carnegie in steel. Well, the Bushes family made their money with Harriman and Carnegie in the steel plants and railroads in Ohio. So they, at the same time the slavocrat Walker family was making their money, the Bushes were doing it with the big difference between slave stage and the capitalist stage is the difference between chattel slavery and wage slavery. So Walkers were making theirs with chattel slaves, the Bushes were making theirs with wage slaves, but at any rate, both of these families were certifiable Brahmins, so to speak, and they returned to New England frequently for long summer vacations, and they formed their bond in the seaside resort of Kennebunkport, Maine. Later, these families lived side by side for decades in the wealthy New York City suburb of Greenwich, Connecticut. Like so many dynasties, these were built with fortunes won and nearly lost. in a variety of speculative endeavors that were then applied to the pursuit of political power. In this tale, there is no Joe Kennedy urging his brood to politics, but the cast of characters is compelling, beginning with the Bush patriarch Samuel Prescott Bush. Prescott Bush's first wife died in a Rhode Island accident. The Walker patriarch, George Herbert Walker, afterwards cared for his Bush in-laws as much as he afterwards cared for his own children. Then there was the famed Democrat W. Averill Harriman, who, along with his brother Roland Harriman, sons of E. H. Harriman, the railroad magnate, saved Prescott Bush from bankruptcy. Finally, we have Dorothy Walker, a debutante dynamo, who married Prescott Bush and forever linked these two families. The Missouri financier at his peak. It was 1903, and George Herbert Walker was well on his way toward building a fortune and an extended family that would spawn a senator, 2 governors, and 2 presidents, and maybe a third one now. A tough big man, he had been a Missouri heavyweight boxing champion. Walker liked Scotch whiskey and racehorses and lived in the grand robber baron style. He was the genius behind the successful investment firm he founded and ran mostly by himself, G.H. Walker and Company of St. Louis. Walker not only maintained the Walker Point estate in Kennebunkport, but also a New York mansion on Long Island, a stunning residence in South Carolina, a stunning residence at One Sutton Place in Manhattan, at a 10,000-acre hunting preserve called Duncannon in South Carolina. The Great Gatsby, if that movie ever, if you've read the book or seen the movie, this is the kind of thing that that book was based on, the way Walker conducted himself. But at any rate, what we have here is Walker was attended at all times by 15 servants. He kept a yacht and maintained a private railroad train. He believed in playing golf, hunting, drinking, horse racing, gambling, and kept a second yacht named Tomboy. Eventually he gained a son-in-law named Prescott Bush, who had married his daughter Dorothy, a lady as aggressive as the old man might have desired in a son. Well, now, Diaz Serrano joins the Bush gang, and that's the whole point to this. Diaz Serrano got his big break in 1953 when he met George Herbert Walker Bush. Bush had just formed Zapata Oil in Midland, Texas. The introduction to Bush came for Diaz Serrano from the oilfield service conglomerate Dresser Industries, which was owned by Averill and Roland Harriman, these being the 2 sons I've mentioned before of E. H. Harriman. Now, Bush had to be looking for a Mexican partner. So what they did was, that's why they introduced him to this guy. I mean, they weren't just going around introducing Diaz Serrano to anybody. They knew of him, and they told Bush, well, I think we've got the guy for you. At any rate, Bush had gotten the name for Zapata Oil Company from the movie starring Marlon Brando that was then playing in Texas theaters, called Viva Zapata. This did not indicate any sympathy of any kind for the Mexican revolutionary, of course, but it was only Bush's idea that it would be good PR. People would recognize the name. Now, many of you remember that Butch Cassidy movie, and I'm not going to go back over this again, except to remind you that the Harriman brothers came from railroads, Rockefeller Oil, Carnegie Steel. If you want to see more about this gang, you can watch John Connolly's movie on YouTube, which is 3.5 hours long, called JFK to 9/11. Everything is a Rich Man's Trick. Pretty good documentary movie. The name Zapata for this Bush operation evolved through several stages as the company evolved in its primary focus, a focus that quickly switched from Texas to Mexico. Now, it's obvious to me that from the very beginning, Bush was looking at Mexico. Well, why would he be looking at Mexico? Well, first of all, Mexico, of course, was the #1 oil province for the United States from the very beginning. And he was aware of that, and because he was aware of that, he also knew that Mexico offshore was going to be important. He needed a Mexican who knew the oil business and who could duke him into Mexican government contracts. So that's why he had gone to the Harrimans and they had introduced him to Diaz Serrano. Now, First, Zapata Oil eventually became the Zapata Corporation and then the Harbinger Group, Inc., which it is today, HRG Group. The original founders of Zapata Oil were George Herbert Walker Bush, vice president for the company, the landman for the group, John Overby, Hugh Liedtke, who was the company president, and Bill Liedtke as another board member, and Thomas J. Devine, who was not just a wildcatter like the rest, but a former CIA agent that went covert. The original money investors were 1. Prescott Bush, 2. the Liedtke brothers and their investor group, 3. George Herbert Walker, and 4. a circle of Bush family friends. In 1954, 2 subsidiaries of Zapata Oil called Zapata Petroleum and Zapata Offshore were formed, and into the latter stepped Jorge Diaz Serrano. Thereafter, Diaz Serrano became George H.W. Bush's lifetime business partner and friend, quote unquote. Startup cash came when Eugene Meyer and Philip Graham and an amorphous group of unnamed investors put it together. In 1954, the same year, the U.S. Department of Interior put up for auction mineral rights in the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and on the Central American coast, where it had property, U.S. government property. Those mineral rights, by the way, are put up for auction for whoever comes along and offers to buy them, and you could usually get it for dirt cheap, like $1 an acre. In the last Alaska land auction that I'm aware of, a company run by a con man set up Alaska land leasing, and they bought that Alaska land for $1 an acre, and before he was done, a few months later, he made $200 million. But at any rate, in 1956, Diaz Serrano became one of a select group of oil field privateers, and he was investing in his own businesses. All of these were Mexican government assured sources of income as Pemex contractors. He was George H.W. Bush's ticket into assured payment via the Mexican government and assured contracting via Diaz Serrano's corrupt connections to the Mexican government and its paymasters. The Bush gang proving once again that there is no business like corrupt government business, something that Prescott Bush had learned from George Herbert Walker and John D. Rockefeller when he was working for them as senator from Connecticut. In this period, Diaz Serrano formed at least 5 different companies. I won't mention all the names there in the book, but the most important one was Gulf Marine Drilling, or Permargo, Perforaciones Marinas Golfo. Now, this was the company that would get the leases to do all of the offshore drilling that Pemex was going to do in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, these platforms produce huge quantities of oil, something like 20,000 barrels a day. These companies were corrupt entities because 100% of their Mexican government's contracts came from suborned government officials. This criminal conspiracy was the foundation of what would be the Diaz Serrano and George H.W. Bush personal fortunes. Bush was working up the U.S. ladder of government officialdom with his father's wealth and that of the Walker family his father had married into, and this Mexican venture was George H.W. Bush's own money. His contribution, so to speak, that's own money in quote marks, his contribution to the corrupt goings-on in Mexico, as his contribution continues to be today with the Saudis. I don't know if you know it, but Bush gets a daily CIA briefing, which of course he turns over to the Saudis immediately as part of his deal in the Carlyle Group, named after the Carlyle Hotel, where this bunch of thieves has a weekly meeting. At any rate, in 1959, in January, the Cuban Revolution overthrew the government of Fulgencio Batista. Bush bought control of Zapata Offshore in that year and funded it with $800,000, and in doing this, he also split the Zapata Corporation into 2 independent companies. The Liedtkes were bought out in this way, and they took control of Zapata Petroleum as their compensation for the value they held in the original Zapata oil. With that, in 1963, after merging with South Penn Oil, they became Pennzoil. That's the origin of Pennzoil. Now Zapata Offshore was the sole survivor with the Zapata name of Zapata Oil. In 1959, same year, Bush moved his offices and his family from Midland, Texas to Houston. Houston would give George H.W. Bush access to the Caribbean through the Houston Ship Channel. I see our light is starting to blink up here, so I'm going to run this down for a moment. Just say he did this because of a new business strategy he had developed with Jorge Diaz Serrano, who had corrupt contracts with the Mexican government in his hip pocket. Bush's Zapata Offshore had only a few drilling rigs, but he placed these in the Gulf of Mexico. His longer-term planning can be seen in his decision at that time to open offices in the Persian Gulf, Trinidad, Borneo, and Medellin, Colombia. He took on the Kuwait Shell Petroleum Development Company as Zapata Offshore's next client. And I'm going to stop here for the moment, but just take a look at where they set up those offices. If you set up an office in Medellin, Colombia, it would only be because you wanted to establish relations with the second biggest drug family in the entire country. Enough said for this lecture. We'll continue with the next one.